I don't have to worry about eating too many cookies if the cookies in question are peanut butter. But if I'm trying to watch my diet, then I better stay away if the cookies are chocolate chip or a good oatmeal raisin. Well, I bring that up because it's helpful to know our greatest spiritual temptation. Do you know what yours is? You don't have to share any details, but just put yes or no in the comment section below. I'd really like to know how many people are aware of their greatest spiritual temptation. Hey, this is Looking Intently. I'm going through the book of James right now, and I'm several videos in, so if you've missed any of those, you can click this link in the upper right, and it will take you to those. And then to make sure you don't miss any new ones, click the subscribe button and that bell icon when it appears in the lower right. I'm looking at verse 9 and following today, where James writes, "Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass, its flower falls and its beauty perishes, so also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits." Now what James says there in the second part of verse 10 and verse 11, he's focusing on the rich person, even though it's true of everyone. We're all going to fade away, our beauty's going to perish, but the rich are more inclined to forget that, because maybe they're a little more insulated because of their wealth, and so James focuses on them. But this passage in general raises a couple questions. First of all, what's the basic meaning that James is talking about, where he says, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation? In some translations, it says boast in his high position, and let the rich in his humiliation. So the rich is contrasting with the lowly. It means the poor and the rich. One thing to understand is James is talking to believers in the whole book here. He opens by making that clear. And so he's talking to people who are Christians. And what he's saying to them might not sound like it makes sense. Let the poor boast in his high position, the rich in his humiliation. Well, he's talking, again, in that context of the fact that they're believers, they're Christians. And so he's saying to the poor person, boast in the fact that you are a believer. That despite not having worldly wealth, you have salvation. You've been forgiven. You have the assurance of heaven, and God is working in you right now to transform you into the image of His Son. That's a high position. On the other hand, the rich is to boast in his humiliation. Well, the riches that they might be proud of in general, not when it comes to salvation. I mean, one, the riches are going to fade away from that eternal perspective, but also they play no part in salvation. They don't help at all. Matter of fact, they can hinder. It can be a danger. So you're saying boast in your humiliation, the fact that all this stuff that the world looks at and they're proud of, and you might be tempted to be proud of, it's nothing compared to what's eternally important, compared to salvation. Well, the question to ask next, as always, is how does it fit in the overall context? That's always going to help give an underlying meaning that you'll miss if you just take the verse by itself. Part of the context is the following verse, verse 12, where James writes, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love Him." Well, we first saw that idea of trials in verse 2. Consider it pure joy when you face many trials. And I said there, that word trial means just that, many trials. Trials of many kinds, as some translations put it. It can be outward obstacles. It can be inner things that we're struggling with. It can also be temptation. And that's what James is talking about here. He's warning these two groups, be aware of the temptation that's most inherent to your position. As a poor person, the temptation is to look at their lack of physical things and maybe get resentful at the situation, maybe at God, get upset, get bitter. Perhaps rationalize, well, all right, I'm suffering in this world. I'm not going to limit myself. I'm not going to follow some of God's commands in other ways because, again, I'm already missing out. The temptation for the rich person, on the other hand, is because of those riches, they maybe haven't had to rely as much on others or God in some ways because they've had those riches to rely on and it's gotten them through. And so it's hard for them to develop that trust, that faith that is really the DNA of the Christian life. James is saying to both of them, be aware, this is your greatest temptation because of that physical circumstance. And he also, in talking in verse 12, when he brings up the crown of life, he's saying, listen, believers, These temptations, they can, certainly hinder your relationship with God, but even to the point of some people could possibly turn their back on God and His grace entirely and miss out on the crown of life. Again, salvation is not a matter of our level of works, good and bad, but it is a matter of us relying on God's grace versus turning our back on it. Well, so James is talking here. He's warning them about their greatest temptation. What's the application for us? I think the same thing. We need to be aware of our greatest temptation. Perhaps it is a matter of, physical wealth. Maybe I don't have a lot, maybe I do, and those same temptations apply. I can get bitter if I don't. I can rationalize. I can fail to trust if I have a lot of wealth and haven't needed to trust God as much as maybe other people have, and I miss out there. Perhaps your greatest temptation is something else. I've said before, I am always tempted to get angry when my plans, and I'm a good planner, when things don't go as planned. And that's a temptation to respond that way. I think for all men, there's a temptation to lust. We definitely have to be aware of that. It might be a temptation to be impatient, to be unkind, to be greedy, perhaps to be legalistic. For whatever reason, that's a perspective you struggle with, or maybe the opposite, what is called license. I'm saved by grace. I can do anything I want. You need to be aware of your greatest temptation so you can help to resist that. God is going to help give us the power, but we need to be aware, and we're going to see that in a couple videos coming up. So until then, chew on this some more, and as you're reading the Bible, be sure and read the good book like a good book.